Good morning. My name is Gregory Love, and I'm going to be the person presenting information to you so that we can better understand background checks. Now, the goal of our time today is not simply to provide you academic information to make you smarter about a particular topic, but to help ministry leaders have the necessary information to develop an effective background check strategy, especially as it relates to protecting the vulnerable from sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. So I'm happy to be able to provide this to you as the founder and CEO of MinistrySafe, but also in cooperation and coordination with Tidely, which is another operation dedicated to making the health of the church a priority. So working together with Tidely, want to provide you some information to help you better create a strategy and ultimately provide you some of these services as well. But the goal is not to provide services, providing the education is the key. Now, let me tell you who I am and why I'm the person who's going to be sharing this information with you. I'm a 35-year sexual abuse lawyer, which means I've spent more than 3 decades helping organizations navigate sexual abuse matters. And what I get to do as a civil trial lawyer is I get to stand in train wrecks. And by standing in train wrecks, I get to learn a great deal about sexual abuse risk that most ministry leaders don't get to learn. Now, if you've experienced a sexual abuse crisis, what you're learning about sexual abuse, if that's your teaching moment, is typically going to be related to a certain set of facts. Now, as a 35-year sexual abuse lawyer, see, I don't get a phone call unless something goes wrong. So when I get to that ditch-like experience, and having done that hundreds of times over 35 years, I get to see patterns. Now, that's the good news, actually, the word pattern. You see, because if something has a pattern, that means it's predictable. And if it's predictable, it's preventable. So what I've done is have accumulated information over more than 3 decades and want to distill that and give you some good information so we can learn from other people's mistakes. I can show you this is how it goes wrong so that we can get it right. And background check seems to be one of those tools the churches reach for as a solution to sexual abuse risk. And I want to help you better understand that tool, what it can do, what it can't do, what are some of the myths about this tool, so that we can ultimately create a strategy that's effective in trying to let it do what we think it's supposed to do. So in order for that to be our flight plan, the goal being to give you information necessary to create an effective background check strategy, or evaluate your current strategy to let you better understand, am I doing this correctly? Am I making a mistake similar to one of those ones that has gotten another organization into the ditch? That's part of the goal. Get into the bank of information, shake it up, and use what's valuable and get out of that bank the things that are going to get me into places I don't want to be. So some observations kind of in line with what I've already started to lead with is the background check for ministries, actually all child serving organizations. It seems like the background check is the magic wand. It's almost like that's the go-to resource for ministries and child serving organizations, which I don't have a problem with background checks being a part of a solution, but it's amazing how often a background check is the solution for churches and child serving organizations. So it's important for us to make sure we know things about this resource if that's the primary effort that we're deploying to be able to protect children from sexual abuse. So couple of immediate observations show you some ditch-like experiences just so we can make mental note of. Please understand, a background check is not a character reference. And it seems obvious, but it's amazing how many times when we're standing in a ditch-like experience, a ministry leader will tell us, I'm shocked that this person engaged in that type of behavior because their background check came back that said no records found. And it's kind of like, well, excuse me, explain that to me. And in teasing that out a little bit further, it's amazing how many people will get a report that says no records found and interpret that to mean this person's going to be lovely with 7-year-olds. Okay. That doesn't say that at all. It's essentially telling you there were no records found. Now, spoiler alert, through the information I'm going to provide you, I want to disabuse you of the idea that A report that says no records found does not mean no records exist. Okay, now that's kind of spooky by saying that, but put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to that. But at this juncture, I just want to point out that ditch where people have taken a no records found and used that as some type of a character reference. It's not that. Another observation to make is criminal records were never created for commercial use. Okay, now criminal records were created for the criminal justice system. But see, we found an ancillary use for those criminal records in helping us understand whether we lease somebody an apartment, whether we give them a job, whether we open certain doors to them that might not be appropriate given that past criminal history. So there's value to that information, but we simply need to take inventory of the fact that criminal records were not created for commercial use, which means getting that criminal record in such a way that it can be used for commercial purposes, like child safety, are not easy. See, this is a system where these records are created for the court systems, for the criminal justice process. To take those records and make them available for the commercial use takes a lot of steps to be able to gather the records, make sure that they're computerized, make sure that they're searchable, and then make sure they're accessible and can be provided in a report form. So there's a lot of ways for there to be breakdowns in that information going from its original source in its original use into a place where it becomes useful for ministry leaders in child protection. Okay, so it's not perfect and it's not magic, but it's amazing how many ministry leaders believe that they're going to put a name, they're going to put certain information into a dashboard, and all of a sudden, all the information that exists in the world is going to magically appear. That is just fantasy. So we just simply need to understand these records are useful, but there's a lot of ways there can be breakdowns, which means our ability to access records is not perfect. So create an opportunity to understand criminal records are not perfectly searchable for our use in child protection. Okay, not going to say much more about that except for just trying to disabuse ministry leaders of the fact that this is a Jack Bauer and CSI Miami teaming up to do all this magic behind my computer screen and providing me every piece of data that ever existed. That is just not the way background check reporting works. Okay, so let's make another observation about the background check as the go-to resource. We need to be familiar with this term called standard of care. Now, as a trial lawyer, I use that term all the time, but for lay people, just understand it's a snappy lawyer term for what is reasonable to address a foreseeable risk. In other words, standard of care is the level of things I need to be doing. Here are the reasonable things I need to be doing about a foreseeable risk. And it should be clear by now, after 35 years of doing this work, sexual abuse is a foreseeable risk in ministry. So the question then becomes is, what is standard of care? What is reasonable for me, regardless of where I am in the country, what denomination, what is reasonable to be able to protect children from sexual abuse? The answer most churches would give me is run a background check. I would tell you that that's part of your standard of care, but a background check is not a standalone solution for this problem. A background check is effective within a safety system. In other words, standard of care is what we call a 5-part safety system. At least that's what we call it. It needs to include at least 5 things as the reasonable efforts to prevent this foreseeable risk of sexual abuse. So we call it a 5-part safety system, and it includes these things. Okay, this is just an opportunity at 30,000 feet to evaluate what efforts are in place at your particular ministry, your church, your organization to protect children from sexual abuse. It must include sexual abuse awareness training. There's the training that provides you information about the grooming process, common grooming behaviors, peer-to-peer sexual abuse. In other words, what does the actual risk look like? And training your people, staff members and volunteers, to have the eyes to see that risk as it unfolds. Second is you need to be able to screen. Then there's your background check. Okay. The other parts of your safety system include tailored policies and procedures and a system for monitoring and oversight. Now, these are covered more holistically in a training called child safety workshop. But nonetheless, this diagram is a diagram we use within child safety workshops to help ministry leaders understand your 5-part safety system occurs, some of it in the due diligence process while you're evaluating an applicant, or when you pull them into this almost circle is what we call the sheep pen. That's where children's programming happens, right? So some of your safety system happens before someone has access to children, but then other elements of your safety system happen within programming, your policies and procedures, for example. But see, as part of the due diligence, you'll see background check. And a background check is a part actually of your screening process. Okay, so I'm taking it from 30,000 feet and I'm going to bring us down to 100 feet, because when we talk about screening, the principle underlying that is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. So it is part of standard of care for you to make a reasonable gathering of information about someone's past behavior to discern what is likely for them to do in the future behaviorally. A background check is a part of that screening. It is past behavior information when this person has encountered the criminal justice system. And then, of course, what criminal activity this person may have been engaged in is to help us better understand what this person is likely to do in the future. So if you get a record back that says theft by check, this is not a person you want in your ministry handling money. If this person has got 2 DUIs, you don't want them driving the church van. So the criminal information, again, is past behavior that helps us try to understand what they're likely or foreseeable to do in the future. And a background check fits within that screening process, which includes your application, your reference, and your interview. See, the background check is not your standalone screening. Your background check fits within other elements that pull past information from different places. Application is self-reported. Reference checks are third party. Interview is the opportunity to get that person in front of you and ask particular questions and get around some evasive or some non-answers to things that are unclear. Okay, so a background check fits within a system. It is a bullet. It is just not a silver bullet. All right. So I'm repeating myself because it's amazing how many ditch-like experiences I visit where the background check is the only effort that a church has employed to be able to prevent sexual abuse. Okay, happens within a system. All right. Now the goal is for us to create a strategy in using a background check. And what I want to do is I want to give you some information with the goal being, let's create the right strategy, or let's take the opportunity to evaluate the strategy I'm already deploying to see if I possibly need some modifications, if I need to make some changes, or if I have one of these holy cow moments that I'm doing this epically wrong. This is your chance to make a change before a ditch-like experience really forces you to. So we talked about background checks. It fits within a system, trying to let you know that there's an imperfect way in which this information is gathered from its source and ultimately accumulated on a report. What I want to focus now is on 3 of the big limitations of information not getting to your attention. So it's the idea that there may be somebody who's engaged in bad behavior. This person might be a sexual abuser, but a background check is not going to tell you that. And here are some of the reasons why. Okay, so I'm not trying to discourage you to stop doing background checks. We just need to make a strategy around good information. So let's start by identifying the 3 big categories of limitation that I want to address. And then I'm going to riff off and talk about some of the ways in which that might, in a more granular way, take you to places you don't want to be. But nonetheless, I'm going to walk through the fact that we need to understand a little bit more about sexual abuse as a trauma-creating behavior, then how that encounters the criminal justice system, because it's got to encounter the criminal justice system before it ever has a chance to make it onto a report that's provided to you. So I'm going to walk through that first one, focusing on information just related to the sexual abuse behavior as criminal behavior, and then the criminal justice system before a report is generated. So here's the first piece of information we need to know. And this is really trying to address those of you who are holding on to a background check as if this is the silver bullet that will solve the problem on sexual abuse risk in my ministry, and therefore I don't need to know anything else or do anything else. That's a dangerous position to hold, and here's one of the reasons why. We need to understand that the conservative studies are telling us that less than 10% of sexual abusers will ever encounter the criminal justice system. Okay, now that sounded way too lawyerly. I'm going to break that down. When I say encounter the criminal justice system, what am I referring to? Okay, encountering the criminal justice system is another way of saying will be arrested. You see, the arrest is the kickoff point that starts the criminal justice process. So once there's an arrest, a number of different things can happen. There's a myriad of ways in which records can be created or the process can be truncated or stopped. But it all starts with an arrest. So those persons that are holding onto a background check as if this solves the problem, we first and fundamentally need to know less than 10% of those people that wish to hurt our children will ever be arrested. Okay. Talking about that in the reverse, another way to say that is that more than 90% of the people that wish to hurt our children will never have a record that you could find, and they know it. Okay, so when we identify sexual abuse risk and wanting to identify those people that might hurt children, understand that when you run that background check, 90% of those people that wish to hurt our children don't have anything for you to find, even if Jack Bauer and CSI Miami were running your background checks for you. Okay, we just need to soberly understand background check is a necessary part of what we do to protect children. It just can't be the only thing we do. Now, I remember teaching in a seminary class about 12 years ago and was sharing some information similar to this back then. And about 6 months after that, one of the students saw my wife and I in a restaurant, approached us and said, "Excuse me, I know you don't remember me, but that was some really good information you provided in the seminary class." And I took that back into our leadership and we studied it and we voted and we saved $500 on our budget. I was a little shocked by that. It's like, well, how did you save $500? He goes, "We stopped doing background checks." Like, you're an idiot. Okay. You see, the value of this information was to not let you be discouraged that it's not going to help you. You just need to soberly understand what it can do for you and what it can't. So background checks are necessary. We've got to do it. We just need to soberly understand what it can and can't give us so that when we do it, we don't believe it has some type of value it does not. Okay. So first of all, we need to understand less than 10% of sexual abusers will encounter the criminal justice system. But to help put some more flesh on that and to help you understand some of the challenges that are going to move forward from this, it's important to say a few things about just the behavior of sexual abuse of a child. You see, in that situation, it is a trauma-creating circumstance. But we also know that most sexual abuse experienced by a child comes from somebody within that child's core environment, a family member, a close friend, okay, a neighbor, somebody that child's in constant interaction or regular interaction with in that child's environment. Okay, so oftentimes when that child does report having been sexually abused, that person who is the bad actor is somebody known and trusted by the child. It's somebody within that community. And so often that bad behavior is not reported. That bad behavior, if it's reported, will have serious family impact. See, there's a number of different reasons why that information never gets communicated to child welfare or law enforcement that would give rise to someone asking questions and then forming an arrest. And then that creates the record and then a series of records moving forward. So the nature of this risk is not communicated. Or you'll have a child share this is what their experience, and they'll be disbelieved. They'll be minimized. They'll be told to, ignore this, stand down. See, the information doesn't find its way into the criminal justice system. And oftentimes, even if it does find its way into the criminal justice system, by the time this victim felt comfortable enough to share that information, it might be beyond an actionable statute of limitations from the criminal justice system. It might be that this person doesn't want to prosecute. They just wanted to make the report to protect that next generation of children. Or you may have this mom that doesn't want her 4-year-old to testify. And though she believes the child, she's not going to take the child into that environment for fear it will further traumatize the child. See, there's a number of reasons why this trauma creating behavior is not believed, is not reported, or when it is reported and believed, it doesn't go any further, or because of the time that's run, it's not allowed to go any further. So it's very, very, very difficult to expect this type of trauma creating behavior to ultimately create a criminal record. So there's a number of reasons why this will not change, because of the nature of the behavior and the impact it has on a victim and that victim's family. It's important to know that, especially when we look at the fact that even if somebody does make that report available in a time period that is actionable, once the criminal justice system kicks off, please don't think that an arrest is going to result in a conviction. So we need to understand it's very, very difficult to get an arrest. It is far more difficult to get a conviction. And I just need you to appreciate that, but also understand some of the mechanisms, some of the workings within the criminal justice system to see when this person is arrested. If that person is a juvenile, oftentimes there's a different pathway for dealing with that child who's a sexually aggressive child in what we call peer-to-peer sexual abuse. But if this is an adult, it's still difficult to have these victims come forward and expect this is going to be a criminal justice process where everybody comes forward to testify, which is why we need to appreciate it's hard to get a conviction. But see, even when you get a criminal justice activity, oftentimes the person who's the accused sexual abuser may have been charged with, say, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, but will be allowed to plea down to what we call a lesser offense, a stair-step offense. So it might start with aggravated sexual abuse of a child, but the plea down is indecency, criminal mischief, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And see, when you get those on your report, on your criminal background check report, and you see indecency, it's amazing how often your applicant who was charged with aggravated sexual assault, pled down to indecency, will have a very persuasive story as to what were the facts supporting that indecency. Maybe peeing behind a dumpster, or caught changing clothes after a sporting event, not realizing there was a family in the van next door. Okay. They'll have a very persuasive story about what is indecency that will have very little to do with sexual behavior with a child. Okay. So I'm just letting you know this is what's happening behind the curtain, if you will, in the criminal justice system, which is common. Very difficult to get an arrest. When somebody is arrested and charged, oftentimes the plea down offense will not match the original charge. And we just need to know what some of those common plea down offenses are so that when we finally do get a report back that says there's criminal activity, we don't miss it because we didn't understand that plea down concept. Okay, so it's important to understand some of those common plea down offenses: indecency, voyeurism, criminal mischief, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, assault. See, something might start as sexual assault of a child, but they'll be allowed to plead down to assault. And then they'll give you some story about having to try to break up a bar fight in college, and the cop gave everybody a ticket, and that's what that was about. I'm just such a good guy. Okay. See, in those situations, once you understand that there is a mechanism that allows that plea down, if you finally do get a report that has one of these offenses that you don't understand, my caution to you is don't move quickly. Okay. If it's a charge you do understand, DUI, I know what that means. Okay. Robbery, I know what that means, right? When you get one of these plea down offenses, it's like, I don't necessarily know what this means. When you get an offense that just is, you don't recognize what the criminal activity is associated with this particular charge, here's my suggestion to you. In other words, here's the pro tip for you. You know, in your screening process, you just simply tell your applicants like, whoa, well, what's this about? Here comes the explanation. Do not accept a self-reported explanation related to a charge you don't understand. Okay. That doesn't stop them from giving it to you, Okay. But you just put a pin in it. It's like, wow, that's really unfortunate that happened. I tell you what, I'm going to place the application process on hold, and I need you to bring me the arrest record. Okay. Now, what's magic about the arrest record? Okay. See, they have access to information because they experienced this criminal charge that you don't. And you don't need to make it your job to spend a lot of money and a lot of time to go try to get those records that may not even be available to you. But if you ask your applicant, let's put this on hold, bring me that arrest record. See, the magic of the arrest record is the arrest record will describe exactly what it was that kicked off your needing to be engaged in the criminal justice system. So in other words, if you really were peeing behind a dumpster and didn't see that officer there, the arrest record will say that. If you really were changing clothes after a sporting event next to that family in the van, the arrest record will say that. So they can bring that back to you, and based upon what it says, then you can decide whether you want to move forward. Now, in the multiple times we've given that recommendation to ministries that'll call us and say, well, they got a record that says indecency. And I said, don't tell me. They were peeing behind a dumpster. It's like, how did you know that? It's like, they're always peeing. Actually, they're never peeing. But see, when you've asked them to bring the arrest record in those circumstances, this person has never come back. Okay, because you didn't believe their self-reported explanation that had really nothing to do with that plea down offense of indecency. Okay, now there was one circumstance where a person was a volunteer working the soundboard in a middle school ministry, and this person's wife lost her job, and so the church decided, you know what, we're going to do him a solid, and we're going to start paying him for his work working with middle school on the soundboard on Sundays. But they had a policy that they did not do background checks on volunteers, but they did do background checks for everybody who wore their name tag that they paid. And so as soon as they did that, they ran a background check on the guy and found indecency. He told them about something about peeing behind a dumpster. And of course, he then quit. Now, in this circumstance, we didn't get the opportunity to simply let the person go away because they had been in our program wearing our name tag, working with children. And so when we actually accessed those records that gave rise to the plea down, it was not about peeing. It was a lot about victimizing very, very small cousins. And because it was family, the family did not want to pursue the children testifying and allowed this person to plea down. So in that circumstance, there were a number of other steps to take because we didn't get the benefit of that person coming in and doing the background check as a part of the due diligence, but it was a background check that was done once the person was already moving within our program. So nonetheless, the idea is this, just wanting to give you enough information to understand the workings of sexual abuse as a trauma-creating activity, difficult to get an arrest. But oftentimes, even when you get that arrest, it might not result in a conviction that simply is going to tell you in the report, this person is problematic and this is why. Last thing I want you to appreciate about the criminal justice system is sometimes you may not get a conviction at all. Sometimes the claim will be dismissed. Okay. Sometimes if nobody's going to come and testify, prosecutors can't do anything with that information. So there is a number of situations where you'll have an arrest, but it will not result in a conviction. Okay. So if you have this belief or this mythological understanding that everybody who's a sexual abuser will wind up on a sex offender registry, that's just fantasy. That is not true because it's difficult to get an arrest, even more difficult to get a conviction. It's especially difficult to get a conviction where there's a requirement that somebody register as a sex offender. Okay, so I just want to peek behind that curtain with you so that when you do get a record, please don't think no records found means no records exist. Don't believe that no records found means this person is perfectly safe with children. And don't believe that no records found or that you get a record that's one of these plea down offenses, that there is no problem here. It's just need to use wisdom in trying to discern what I can expect from my background check, because we're trying to create a strategy here. And again, the strategy is not to stop doing it because this is so discouraging and so demoralizing and there's so little information. We just need to use wisdom, have good information. Now, the next limitation I want to focus on is going to be related to the fact that there may actually be criminal information, records that would tell you this person is a problem, but you're not going to get that information because of some of the legislation exists. It's going to limit that being made available. Okay. So let me back out to 30,000 feet and help you understand. The background check industry is governed by federal law. Okay. Before there was a background check industry, there was a credit reporting industry. And there were people that are abusing credit reports such that people couldn't get jobs, they couldn't get cars, they couldn't buy businesses, they couldn't engage in commercial activity because of information that was reported on a credit report. And so there was a need to balance the application of this information that restricted people's access, but also to balance the need of the consumer. This person needing a do-over, or this person needing to contest information that's not mine. It's a mistake by a credit report or a credit card company. Okay, so that balancing, that federal governance of credit reports was already in place. And then the background check industry started to skyrocket. Okay, typically right around 9/11, after the crisis of the Twin Towers bombing, okay, where there became a desperate demand for information, and of course the internet with the ability to deliver that information. Now, when background check industry was initiated, there was a lot of breakdowns, a lot of abuses, there was a lot of mistakes, and there was a need for somebody to be a sheriff in town, if you will, to protect the consumer. So rather than creating the Fair Background Check Reporting Agency, the existing framework that already existed was the Fair Credit Reporting Act, okay, the FCRA. It's federal law that governed, credit reporting. They decided we'll be the sheriff in town. Okay, so background checks from criminal records came underneath the FCRA. But when these record reporting system for criminal records came under the FCRA, you see, there was already some of the behaviors to balance the need for the information versus the rights of the consumer that kind of came over into the criminal record reporting industry without people understanding the consequences of some of those balancing. Say, for example, in the credit reporting world, somebody might get a bankruptcy experience, okay? But that can't haunt you for the rest of your life. So there wound up being a balance for the consumer that this bankruptcy will be reported for 7 years. And after that 7 years, the bankruptcy will fall off your credit reporting for it to be considered by that person you want to get an apartment from, or buy a car, or buy a business, okay? So that 7 years, almost like this year of Jubilee, you get a do-over. So when the FCRA became the framework for deciding how to report criminal records and criminal information, they decided here's the framework for what limits will be placed on background check providers. Okay, so it's covered by the FCRA, which is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And part of me sharing this with you again is to help reinforce the idea no records found does not mean no records exist. There can be a criminal history and you not being provided that information. And the federal law framework is one of those ways in which those limits might exist and you not know it. Okay. So the FCRA defines background check providers as CRAs. Okay. That's not necessarily important unless you're going to read the federal law. But here's the background check providers limit. If it's a criminal conviction, background check provider can provide that information no matter how old it is, regardless of the age of the record. If it's a non-conviction, however, it's like there's that kind of year of Jubilee idea, okay, that I can only give you non-convictions up to 7 years. And let me explain what I mean by that. Remember, it's difficult to get an arrest, but once you get an arrest, let's say that the process does not complete unto a conviction, which in the sexual abuse world is common, okay? Arrest records are very important in the sexual abuse prevention world. But nonetheless, if it's an arrest that does not result in a conviction because there was a deferment, because there was a dismissal, there was an acquittal, somebody didn't want to testify and it had to be dropped, for whatever reason, the arrest does not result in a conviction, Those are very important records, but federal law says I can only give you those if they are 7 years or younger. If they happened within a 7-year period of time from the time you're asking for a report to be submitted to you. Okay. Now, that to me gets my attention. That is challenging to me as a sexual abuse expert. So I can give you records no matter how old they are, if it's a conviction, but non-convictions only within 7 years. Okay. That is federal law. I see all kinds of criminal information, multiple arrests for an aggravated child sexual assault that did not result in a conviction. If it's over 7 years old, I am looking at this information, and by federal law, I cannot give you that information. So that is an actual person who's engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior with a child, but I couldn't get a conviction, can't give you that information if it's over 7 years old. All right. Nonetheless, that's the federal framework. That's what some of the pre-balancing that came over into the criminal records reporting before anybody really appreciated what that would mean for the sexual abuse prevention industry. If it's simply about someone who got a DUIs or didn't get a conviction or any number of other type of criminal behaviors, I can see the need to balance. It's just difficult to recognize this balance as it relates to child sexual abuse prevention. All right. So that's the federal framework. That's what's going to limit every background check provider nationally. But the real focus that I want to get into is now the state laws. Okay. Because when the federal government provided its framework, what it did essentially was handed the wand to the respective states and said, look, that is our aperture. Okay. You can't make our aperture more expanded than that, but you can make it more narrow. And so the first state to pick it up was California, of course. And California decided that's way too open. We need much more narrow to protect the consumers in California. So the state law in California is this. As a background check provider, and we serve entities in California, state law in California is this. I can only provide you convictions up to 7 years. I cannot provide you non-convictions at all. Okay. For those of you listening, you're like, well, that's crazy. It's like, I agree with you. Now let's use a practical example as to why I would think that's crazy if you're not seeing it clearly, not yet. Let's take Larry Nassar, for example, of USA Gymnastics fame. Let's say that somehow Larry Nassar magically paroled out of the Michigan prison system and wanted to work with little gymnasts in Texas. And Texas is one of those states that has no additional limitations beyond the federal aperture. Okay. So in Texas, for example, if he wanted to work with little gymnasts, we'd pop those records every day and twice on Sunday. Now, if Larry Nassar instead wanted to work with little gymnasts in California, his report will come back, no records found. That should haunt you. Hundreds of victims, pled guilty to federal charges related to child pornography and charges related to, sexual offense related to female gymnasts, no records found. Why? Because all of those criminal records are from 2015. They're over 7 years old. As a background check provider, I can be looking at a notorious sex offender and all of these criminal records, and under state California law, I cannot give you that information. Okay. Now, it's not just California, because you see, different states took on the California approach, but other states decided to balance it a little differently. So there's like a patchwork of different states allowing different information, and sometimes driven by how much the position pays. In addition to that, some states are actually purging their records. Okay, purging records. So, for example, if a state purges their records and you run a background check, say 3 years from now, all the records are gone that you would want to be able to access to tell you whether this person is foreseeable risk related to sexual abuse based upon their past criminal behavior. Okay, so there's a lot of decisions being made at the state level that are further complicating your ability to gain past information related to criminal behavior when we think that everyone should be outraged by child sexual abuse risk. Everybody is abhorring this idea of Boy Scouts of America having 88,000 male victims, or this diocese, or this particular camp, or this particular youth sport organization. It's like we're all horrified by the idea of child sexual abuse, yet The laws are moving in such a way that records are getting more and more difficult to access. So we would be outraged by the bad behavior, but a lot of people taking away your ability to gain some of this very, very important insight from these records. Okay. But let's stay with this idea of state law limitations, because that's going to feed into that third reason why there are limitations that you need to be aware of. Okay. Say, for example, California put those limits on that convictions only within 7 years. Well, they were joined by Montana, Kansas, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, and Washington State. Okay. 7 years of convictions only. Because those are some serious limitations in those states, whereas in the state of Texas, there's no limit on what age the record is that I can provide you as it relates to convictions. But see, there's also that non-convictions idea. California is not the only state that decided no non-convictions at all. They're joined by Kentucky, New Mexico, and New York. Some states like Massachusetts, you can't even run the background check until you've offered them the job. Okay, so it's becoming more and more difficult to navigate some of these state laws and some of the restrictions on the information that you need to be able to make good decisions about applicants. But just for this standpoint, just understand there's a patchwork of different rules per state. And as a background check provider at MinistrySafe that serves all 50 states, we have to know what all of these different apertures are state to state and when they change, because the goal here is to provide every piece of information we can permitted under your particular state's law or the federal law if there is no additional state restrictions. Okay, so it's an important goal at MinistrySafe to make sure when the priority is protecting children from sexual abuse and those who serve them, we need to make sure that we can give all that information permissible by law, but it requires us to understand what are these state by state limitations. All right, now just know that it's different by state and they're constantly changing. And the constant change are further limits, not expanding. So of those states that have limited the records that can be provided, none of them have yielded and started to open that back up. Now, one of the things that we're doing at MinistrySafe is engaging in an effort to try to change federal law, to try to open those apertures as it relates to any organization that serves children. Kind of the idea being, if you want a job at Home Depot or Starbucks and you're in one of those states, great, limited all day long. But if you want a job in a daycare, youth sport coach, youth ministry, there needs to open that up so that every conceivable record is available, because the risk to children should outweigh everything. So that's one of the things that we're busy doing at MinistrySafe. If we're successful at getting that change made, I assure you, we will let the entire world know it. But for right now, it's important to know there's a federal framework, and then there are state law frameworks, and that these laws are constantly changing. Just simply need to know that, because you're trying to create a strategy. And if you're in one of those states where there are limitations, your strategy might be a little different than in the state just next door to you. Okay. But let's get into this last limitation category. Okay. And this is related to the vendor that you choose. Okay. So there's the records that are created. Okay. It's difficult to get an arrest, but let's say that you've got an arrest, you've got some record that's available. Now you got to fight through what are these states that are limiting. But for me to tell you that some of these states are going to limit, see, I'm in Texas, and there's a number of people just like me in Texas that's one of those other states that there's no further state limitations that says, okay, well, I don't live in California. That's another good reason. But why do I care if there are limitations in other states? Because that doesn't affect me in my state. Actually, it might. And that's why the item here that we're discussing is you might have information that's limited that you can access because of the state you live in, but it may also be limited arbitrarily by the vendor you choose. And I want to explain what I mean by that, because this is typically something that ministry leaders do not understand unless there's a crisis. Let me set the stage this way. Had a large Dallas church where they had a man in their congregation that was arrested for possession of child pornography. Okay, and everybody knew it. The whole community knew it. It was in the paper, caught up in part of a sting. All right, but nonetheless, 6 months later, this man volunteered to work in VBS. Now, the church was like, well, there's no way in the world we're going to allow this person to have a role working with children in our church. But we really like his wife. Okay, so we really want to go through the process and make sure they know we're not just being arbitrary. So they ran his background check with the expectation that we'll let the background check tell him, sorry, bro, can't work with VBS this year. But when they ran the background check, it came back, no records found. And that horrified them because they knew there was a record. They were reading about it in the paper. They'd been counseling his wife. So they called their background check vendor, got a couple people in cubicles that just helped them chase the bunny around the tree, but gave them no real answers as to why it came back no records found when they know for a fact this person was now part of the criminal justice system. So when they called us because they were using us for training and they were using a different background check vendor for the criminal background checks, but when they asked us about this, like, well, we have some theories about that, but let's go ahead and run the background check. And when we ran the background check, we found it immediately. And they said, well, why did you find it and this other vendor did not find it? I was like, well, you probably need to check your contract because I have a feeling they're selling you a California search. I said, what do you mean selling me a California search? And I went on to explain to them about how this federal framework limits some on non-convictions and that how the states have modified that aperture. And see, California would not have permitted you to have that record. I said, but we're not in California. Your vendor may be treating you like you're in California. Why don't you use your vendor and send yourself a background check request and let's see what that reveals to us. And when they did, they got this type of, of course I blocked the name of the vendor they were using. Okay. But when he got that on his mobile device, and everybody's seen this on the mobile device, they go through and they scroll through things. Nobody reads it. They just submit the information. They hit accept and submit at the bottom of it because this information is what's required under federal law to disclose to the consumer. Here's what's about to happen that might involve your criminal records being reported to a third party. And in this disclosure, it said, this particular company is going to obtain a consumer or investigative report as defined for in California employment purposes. Okay, it says right there, we're going to treat your background checks as if your people are California employees. And the ministry, to me, that was just clear as day. But the ministry is like, what in the world? Why is that significant? I was like, you see, this particular background check company that you've hired has decided it's too dang hard to create searches of all different apertures and to make those different in all the different states. They needed or wanted, probably for profit purposes, to create a one-size-fits-all background check. But see, you can't create a one size of a Texas size and sell that in some of those other states because the aperture is too wide. So what they did was the reverse. They created what's called a California search, at least that's what I call it. It's a California search that fits the California parameter, and they're selling that to every other state, not telling them that they've arbitrarily limited what's available in your search because it's easier for them, more convenient, and more profitable. But see, they did disclose it. We're going to treat you like you're in California. Okay, but then I explained to the impact of that. What is the rule in California? What does a California employment purposes search look like? Convictions only within 7 years, non-convictions not at all. So when you run this search in your Dallas, community for that guy, for example, that had the arrest for possession of child pornography, it's an arrest. It's not a conviction. And under California law, non-convictions will not be reported, and therefore it was not. But see, even if the person would have been convicted, if that conviction was over 7 years old, under that same California parameter, it would not have been reported. Okay, that blew their minds because they had no idea they were limiting their background check in such a way and weren't convinced with this alone. I said, all right, go ahead and pull up your contract. And when they did, here's what the contract told them. And in their searches, they were paying $49 a search. But the search was limited to a scope of 7 years, criminal convictions only. They fully disclosed it-ish, but the people at this church, even though it was a large church and had sophisticated leadership, they did not understand what this means. They did not understand that this background check provider was telling them, we're only going to give you criminal records up to 7 years, and you're going to pay a premium for it. Okay. Now, they made a switch, but the question they asked, which is a disturbing question, is, should we go back and rerun all of our background checks if all of the searches up to this point were only for 7 years convictions only? And my recommendation was, yes, you're going to need to run all of your background checks again. Cost them a lot of money. Of course, it cost them less than $49 a search, but they had to go repeat everything and explain to their congregation why they had to do so. Okay, so this was rude for them, but they didn't know it until they had a ditch-like experience. Now, this is common, but when we talk about why this is significant on the non-convictions, see, it's hard enough to know that there is a company out there that's arbitrarily limiting those records to 7 years of convictions only. But see, no non-convictions at all, like the arrest for child pornography possession. No, that was not reported. That would have been a critically important piece of information. They had already known it was disqualifying. But see, when we look at non-conviction information, I can give you examples of rape by instrumentation, lewd and lascivious conduct for a youth worker, attempted child sexual abuse. All of these are non-convictions. Non-convictions are very, very important information that we need to get. And to have a background check provider that's arbitrarily not giving us that information, no matter what way in which they try to explain that, is important for us to know. Now, let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, here's another entity. Now, I blocked their name, but of course, if you use them, you might recognize their website by the colors, the fonts. In their website, okay, it's not looking at the contract, it's not trying to find some secret squirrel information on the disclosure. This is part of their marketing material. So on their website, they're telling you about criminal case reporting as it relates to non-convictions. This might be hard to read. I'm going to read it to you. This company does not report non-convictions, as we pride ourselves on following the EEOC's best practice guidances. Okay, full stop. 35-year sexual abuse lawyer, I'm looking at this going, that makes me shake my head. Okay, first of all, the guidance on non-convictions is not the EEOC, it's the FCRA. Okay, EEOC is advisory, it's guidelines. Okay, and they're telling you we do not report non-convictions as we pride ourselves on following something that is not federal law. But they go further, they double down. We act as advocates for our clients by reporting information you can consider for hiring decisions. Wait, you act as advocates for your client by not giving me information I am otherwise entitled to under the FCRA. That makes no sense to me. But see, it requires organizations that may not have the experience and depth of understanding of the FCRA and background checks. If you're a ministry leader trying to read this and see that somebody is telling you, we're going to do you a favor and not give you non-convictions. See, you're fighting through some marketing language when someone is trying to make extra money, not give you information, but try to convince you they're doing you a favor by that behavior. Okay, but if you go down further into this web page where it talks about their criminal convictions reporting, here's where it tells you about 7-year unlimited criminal records. Okay, 7-year unlimited. When I say 7 years unlimited, what does your mind focus on? Which word? People hear unlimited. Okay, I'm going to give you everything so long as it happens within 7 years. Okay, that is another way of saying it's a California search. It's going to be 7 years of convictions, non-convictions, not at all. And this is being sold nationally. This company is plugged into some church management softwares. And it really alarms me because churches can't easily fight through the marketing material to know what you're getting and when arbitrary limits are being placed on you. So just to go back up to 30,000 feet, it's hard to get an arrest. But once you get an arrest, or even if that arrest gets into a conviction, having that information is critically important. Knowing that there are federal and state laws that are going to try to place limitations on that is hard enough. But when you have background check vendors that you're actually paying money to, as a person or an entity that's going to give you criminal records and they're limiting them and not telling you or not making it easy to discern, to me is problematic. In fact, it's dangerous in the ministry marketplace. But because this is taking place in the ministry marketplace, it's important that ministry leaders be good consumers. You just need to get some of this information. So not only can you create a correct strategy, you're not creating a correct strategy and the vendor is not giving you the information consistent with your strategy. Okay, so we need to know when there are those arbitrary limits, which is why when I tell people this is the MinistrySafe philosophy on background checks, a lot of people look at me and like, well, of course, that's what everybody does. And so our philosophy is we're going to search all the records within the requested search parameter, and we're going to report to you all information allowable by law. That sounds basic. That sounds like, well, of course, that's what every background check company does. That's just not true. It's what every background check company should do. But at least with MinistrySafe as sexual abuse experts, we're selling out on understanding sexual abuse as a criminal behavior, sexual abuse as reportable information, understanding all the variable parameters that are restriction by law. Our goal is to give you everything we can within your search parameter and the allowable, legal restrictions in your particular jurisdiction. Not common. Okay, but nonetheless, now I want to take that information and get now to how do I take that information and create a strategy? How do I evaluate my present strategy? Some of you have some homework to do. And some of you, it may be, we need to go pull up some information about our background check provider and find out whether someone's slipping us the rubber peach on arbitrarily limiting those records. And don't think that will be easy to discern. So if you need some help discerning that, perhaps I can help you fight through some of that marketing language. But nonetheless, there may be some work to do at this juncture. Now, with this in mind, here are some of the things that I would want you to know about evaluating your present strategy or creating one that's fresh. Okay. First of all, when we're going to select a search or build a search, oftentimes we need to know, well, what is a search? Okay, I just thought it was magic. I just thought I put in this information and it spits out, here's the records related to this person. That's not the way it works. Okay, keep in mind, criminal records were not created for commercial use. Criminal records were not assembled into a computer database and made searchable in a perfect way. Now, there's been organizations that have tried to do that, but see, you've got to decide what is the search I need, and then how might that need a strategy implication. So let's start by just talking about a basic search. Okay. And when I talk about background checks, really, people will say to me, well, I'm using this vendor. Can you compare what background checks MinistrySafe is doing? Like, here's the kind of Apple we're using. What kind of Apple do you have? It's like, no. You see, it's really difficult to have that conversation unless the person I'm talking to understands a background check is more of a fruit salad than it is an apple. Okay. It starts with a basic fruit cup. But see, then you can add additional pieces of fruit to your fruit salad depending on your need. So when we talk about a basic search or the fruit cup, if you will, this is the basic search. And the basic search is going to start with what we call the Social Security number identifier or the identity research. Again, I'm trying to use language that's not just how we use the language at MinistrySafe, but my goal is to help you to evaluate what you're doing at present. So if you've pulled up the information about the background check vendor that you're relying upon, and you're trying to decide, is what I'm purchasing the basic search, or is it less than that? Because there are organizations out there that are going to sell less than what MinistrySafe would call the base, just the baseline search. Okay, but let's talk about the baseline search, and then I'll make some comments that are going to be ancillary to that. So the fruit cup, if you will, starts with identity research. So when a person presents to themselves to you, say, I'm Gregory Love, and I'd like to work with young people here, hopefully they're asking me for my ID. In other words, they're not going to just take my word for it that I am who I say I am, because see, if I am a sexual abuser and I want access to the children for ill intent, and I don't need to show you my ID, what's the quickest thing I'm going to do? I'm going to give you somebody else's. I'm going to give you my brother's name. I know his social security number. I'm going to let you treat me like I'm not me. So it's important that the first part of it is we're going to do the identity research, hopefully with you asking them for their ID, so that you can establish this person is, in a photo identification, who they say they are. Now, when you run the identity research, here's what's happening. It's identifying the aliases and counties of residence. Because see, the identity research is like grabbing the top part of a credit report. Now, don't freak out when I say credit report. We're not checking people's credit. Okay. It's gathering the information that's the identity information, because if you want to know information about what names people have used or what places they've lived, typically it's the people that know the most are the people they've owed money to. So after they're 18 years of age, this top part of the credit report is going to identify all the counties of residence, if you've engaged in our commercial system, and all the aliases this person has been known by, gone by, or has used in stream of commerce. So my wife, for example, has 16 different variations of her name. Some of them are hyphenated, some of them are misspelled, some of them are nicknames. Okay, this is all the list of names, and it's important to identify all those variations of the names, because the next step of your background check is taking those names into a national criminal database. Sometimes it's called a multi-jurisdictional database. It's essentially a wholesaler. And this wholesaler, and there's 2 or 3 big wholesalers out there that are buying up every criminal eviction record, every record available, whether it's traffic tickets, whether it's bankruptcies, divorces, all this information becomes searchable. And what information it searches depends on what parameters you give it going into this national database. So even though it's a gathering of all the conceivable records in the country, it might be the best collection of data on a community in the world, not to be confused with perfect. Okay, so some of the estimates are that there's probably about 55% of all existing records are in this national database. Okay, and whether it's in there or not can depend on a number of different variables, whether someone did the data entry, whether someone spelled the names correctly. Some counties are still working with paper records and it's not computerized. Okay, so there's a number of different ways there could be breakdowns from this information being complete. But accept the fact that it's probably 55 to 60% complete, depending on where you live and what source of the records you're seeking. Okay, not perfect, large, but not perfect. So it starts with identifying all the names that are taken into that criminal, national criminal database. Now, let's reverse engineer for a moment. What if the identity research was not done? And there are entities out there that are selling background checks that will not do the identity research. In other words, there's a shelf even lower than the basic shelf at MinistrySafe, with background check companies willing to sell you this and brag about the fact that they're cheaper than the next guy because they're cutting this piece out. But by cutting this piece out, here's essentially what's happening. If this person is a sexual abuser and then they're Donald Ray Smith, and they give you the name Donnie Smith, well, what it's going to run through the National Criminal Database is Donnie Smith. Well, this person's criminal records are not identified under Donnie Smith. They're under Donald Ray Smith, okay? And they may have misspelled Donnie, okay? So when you do the aliases, it gives all the variations of this name and takes all of the aliases into the National Criminal Database to try to match every conceivable variation of this person's name associated with the Social Security number. But if all you do is allow your person with a bad actor to give you the name they want you to take through the database, you see, that's the perfect storm for you. You're creating some system, some element, a background check to identify this person with ill intent. And because you did not do the identity research, they did not match that record with anybody in the National Criminal Database. So the very people that you would want to identify would be especially those people that would want to abuse this system. So if they even called you and asked you, hey, what kind of background checks do you run? And they do the research and find out there's no identity research, you're inviting somebody to be able to come to your church with ill intent, knowing your background check is not going to do its job. Okay. So the identity research is critical to identify the aliases, but it's also critical in understanding places of residence, especially counties. Okay, and I'm going to say more about counties in just a moment, because a county search is a critical piece of your fruit salad. That's where most of your best information is going to come from. But back to our basic fruit cup, identity research, take all the aliases into a national criminal database and the sex offender registry. Now, I want to take a couple more things about the sex offender registry. Some of your searches will say we're going to do a national sex offender registry. There's no such thing as a national sex offender registry. There is a number of state sexual offender registries, and the national is just kind of a coordination of searching all of them at the same time. In other words, they all report to a central place that can be searched. But regardless, that sexual offender registry is typically going to be included in your national criminal database search. Okay, so this is a fruit cup: identity, national criminal background check, sex offender registry. There's your basic search. All right, and let me describe to you. That's what it looks like in a list form. But when we put that into a graphic, you'll see this is how MinistrySafe depicts a varying level or opportunities for search levels. You see, there's no magic, Jack Bauer in the name or any super duper, type of search. Don't want to provide any misleading language in a marketing form. It's just a growing number of level number, depending on what all is added into your fruit cup to make it a more robust fruit salad. So when we talk about the level one, this level one includes just what I showed you a moment ago: identity research, national multi-jurisdictional database, and the sex offender registry. Okay, and you can see the background checks can build by adding additional information. And adding additional information, some people ask, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't everything be in the National Criminal Database? Well, it's because of what I've shared with you. Just the various breakdowns that keep this from being complete means you'd add other forms of fruit to your salad, because you see all of these records located in different places. Municipal records, they're located in the municipal courts. Okay, county records are at the county courthouse. Federal records at the federal courthouse. Different attorney general records are going to be at the state. Motor vehicle records will be with the departments of transportation. So Interpol records will have the international record. I mean, there's a number of different sources for information. And what you're trying to do is build a strategy to get the information necessary to understand, is this person a foreseeable risk based upon their past criminal behavior? Okay, so you can see level two, for example, is the same thing as level one, adding the motor vehicle report. So if I have a role where I need to run a background check on somebody, but they're also going to be driving children or vulnerable adults, I'm going to go ahead and add that motor vehicle record, and it's already in a pre-created package called level two. Now, all of this can be customized, and this form of a depiction is common with most background check vendors. It might look different colors, different ways in which to depict it, but this is not uncommon. What is uncommon is getting into the granular. Does it include identity research? Okay. Are you going to report records in a limited way that are not easily disclosed to me? All right, but nonetheless, now we're just building a strategy with you having bookmarks in your brain that there's some information you need to go get if you're using a vendor other than MinistrySafe. Okay, let me finish the thought I had now on the county searches, because when we're talking about these variety of places where criminal records live, know that there's a priority on the county records as it relates to sexual abuse. And the reason why I say that is most sexual abuse behavior that is criminal is prosecuted at the county level. Okay. See, a lot of people go, no, man, I've watched all those documentaries on the FBI. The FBI, they got the best information right there. I'm going straight federal. It's like, well, that's not a good decision, because you see, the Federal Bureau of Investigation investigates federal crimes. Sexual abuse typically is not prosecuted at the federal level, so the FBI is not the person doing the investigation. Most sexual abuse activity is prosecuted at the county level, which means that's where the best information lives, is at the county level. Now, it's hopeful that those counties are reporting the information into the National Criminal Database that you can get for that basic search, that level one with all the aliases. But we need to understand that there are breakdowns, which is why when you start looking at a deeper search, adding the county is a critical piece of fruit to add to your salad, because that's where the most important records are maintained. So when you go back to that diagram, You can get county records that are reported in the National Criminal Database. But once again, if I have the budget, I need to make sure I'm not wrong. I'm not going to rely on all the perfection of the system that's not perfect to get it into the National Criminal Database. I want to go specifically to the county of residence. And I say county of residence because this county search is not going to go get all 3,000 counties in the U.S. You are specifically targeting a particular county, and it's county of residence. Some of the studies will tell us most people that are criminally prosecuted are criminally prosecuted for doing things in the same place they live, which is why county of residence records are an important add to your fruit salad. So you can see on a level 3 is what we would call that at MinistrySafe, which is your basic fruit cup, gets you the big national cut of the information, taking advantage of these wholesaler that wants to pull every record they can get, but then surgically adding the county of residence. Okay. And you can see the searches continue to build. And that county of residence from there on out, and when you build a search with MinistrySafe going up in those levels, is going to add the county in every circumstance. Especially when you get over into the levels 6 and 7, you'll see where the check mark plus, meaning it's going to gather every county, okay, not just the county of residence. And of course, you can create some custom packages where you can, if you're in a metropolitan area and you know you're going to be drawing people from the 4 different counties, you can custom create a package that's going to specifically go grab those 4 counties. Now that person could have a arrest record in another county, and hopefully that National Criminal Database will pick that up. But nonetheless, we add the surgical county of residence or add additional counties. Now you get some flexibility depending on who you're doing a search on and your budget. But it's just important to point out, this is how these searches build, so that you, using now wisdom with what I've shared with you and hopefully continuing to be a student, can make good decisions on a strategy decision. A couple things about federal charges, because I already mentioned earlier about the man that was arrested for possession of child pornography. The value of a federal record in terms of child sexual abuse is really related to child pornography, possession or distribution of child pornography. Okay, those are federal charges. Okay, so even when you have a sexual abuser that's taking a child across state lines, that can result in a federal charge. But typically when you're taking a child across state lines, you're talking about an abduction offender, not a preferential offender. And if you don't know the difference between the abduction offender and the preferential offender, I would highly recommend either our sexual abuse awareness training or the child safety workshop. Critical, important distinction. So federal charges are important to gather when you start getting the ability to add additional fruit to your salad because your budget will permit it. I just want you to understand, this is what the federal records can give you. Hopefully, again, those are included in the multi-jurisdictional database. But if you get to the point where you have somebody about whom you can't be wrong, and you need to build a search package that's specifically going to access the county and also access the federal, that's going to feed into your decision making. I just wanted you to know this is how this chart builds out. Here's the different records that are available and why they're made available, and the priority of each of those in trying to understand whether somebody has a background in sexual abusive behavior that you need to rule out. Okay, so let's talk a moment about depth of search. And I've already just started to scratch that itch on the people about whom I can't be wrong, because see, some churches are small. Their budgets are limited. They're just going to run the lowest level they can get access to. Hopefully it includes the aliases, but nonetheless, they're going to do the basic search. My high encouragement is do the research to understand where is the good information, possibly challenge your opening up the aperture on a deeper search, especially if you have people in your ministry about whom you can't be wrong. And typically in a ministry, there are going to be some people about whom you can't be wrong. Okay, so in student ministry, after 29 years of serving in student ministry as a small group and teaching leader, some of the reality, even as a volunteer, I had more interaction with young people than most of the people at the church that were paid staff. Okay, so when we're running background checks, you see, there's some people that have very little interaction with children, and we still run the background check. But we need to understand there are other people with different intensities of relationships, and we need to factor that into our strategy. So there may be a need at your ministry to run a deeper search on certain people. Some churches, for example, like, nope, we're doing the county of residence on everybody. That's going to become our new basic because we need to have that county information on all the people that work at our church. Great. If your budget permits that, I would absolutely raise that bar. But for those churches that are still struggling, it's like, okay, what you need to do is understand who are the people I can't be wrong about. Student ministers, children's ministers, some of those people that are counseling ministers. They're going to be behind closed doors with people that are in vulnerable situations or teenagers. So when you evaluate whether you do a deeper search based upon the role, whether this person has an intensity of interaction that's different than your rank and file greeter, or if they have the opportunity to create trusted time alone. If this is going to be a person in a role that's going to take children away from the campus or have them in off-season kind of times, away from the predictable and repeatable patterns of the church, the type of relationship is going to drive whether or not you need to do a deeper search. Another category that might lean toward a deeper search is the nature of the population those people are serving. Say, for example, if it's a special buddies program with some vulnerable adults or some special needs children, that's the highest vulnerability of populations that you serve. For those people, we can't be wrong. We just simply need to do a deeper search on those people because of the nature of the populations they're being served. Okay, so you get to decide, because there is no one size fits all ministry or ministry program or budget. You've got to balance what information I need. And oftentimes we need to consider a deeper search about some of those people about whom we can't be wrong. And these are some of the categories that determine, is that a person about whom I can't be wrong? All right. Now, here's what I would recommend along those lines. Be prepared to create tiers. Okay. So say your tier one is just your rank and file person that wears a name tag, paid or unpaid. Remember, whether somebody gets a background check is not dependent on whether they're paid. Now, this is a truth that can be clearly seen from the insurance industry, who pay the claims related to sexually inappropriate behavior that takes place at a church. You see, in those situations, 50% of the time, the bad actor is a volunteer. 30% of the time, it's another staff member. 20% of the time, it's another child. Peer-to-peer sexual abuse. Okay. See, 50% of the risk in the church comes from those people that don't get a paycheck. And for most of my churches, you're not turning away volunteers. We're needing volunteers. And we don't want to trouble them. We don't want to make it difficult to become a volunteer. So the people, the category, 50% of our risk comes from the people we don't want to trouble. Okay. We need to make sure that we create a system that protects children, and everybody goes through that system, whether we pay them or not. So whether we pay them or not is not the determiner on whether we do a search or what depth of search. What determines whether we do the search is if you wear a name tag, and the depth of search should be driven by these things, not their paycheck. So in creating those tiers, you might have your tier that, here's my greeters, here's my parking posse, here's my people that serve in a role, paid and unpaid, but don't necessarily have interaction with vulnerable populations. I might create another tier for those people that do. Maybe it's just a tier for everybody, and then here's my people about whom I can't be wrong. You identify the roles in the church that are going to have those intensities of interaction or the ability to create the trusted time alone or leave campus with children or vulnerable populations. And these are the people I do a deeper search. Now, deeper search. What deeper search? Again, then you go back to that diagram and decide, how much depth do I need? What is my budget? How many of those people are there? So just some wisdom to be applied. And I'm not trying to make those decisions for you. I'm telling you there's a decision to be made. I'm telling you these are some of the variables that if I were with you face to face would be on my mind, that I would want to be on your mind. And it's now leaving it up to you to work through a strategy. And let me help you if I can. But nonetheless, most of my people, once they've had this information, it's pretty clear to them who those people are in their churches, and they know how to move forward. Here's some other best practices I want to go ahead and start. I see the runway. We're going to land the plane. Periodically refresh your background checks. And tell your people you're going to periodically rerun those background checks. I mean, I had one large church that they asked us, okay, well, what recommendations can you make about our background checks? Like, well, how often do you rerun them? How often do you refresh those background checks? I said, what do you mean? I said, well, Do you run a background check? Yes. When we hire someone to bring them on as a volunteer, but you never rerun it. It's like, right. Do we need to? Now, you had some people that have been at that church serving in capacities for 15, 16, 17 years. So I said, well, how would you know if one of these people had encountered the criminal justice system since the day you hired them? I said, maybe they would tell us. It's like, I doubt it. Okay. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to start a process of refreshing these background checks every 2 years or every 3 years. And I want you to tell your people we're going to do it. The people that are already in as legacy people they're already serving, and those people that are coming in as new hires or new volunteers. The big idea is this. I want you to unapologetically tell them we're going to periodically run these background checks because our children deserve our best. Now, in that situation, going back to that example, I told them, not only do I want you to run the background checks again, I want you to tell everybody that you're doing it. And in that messaging, say something like this, and they did. Said that, well, people were going to run a search. We're actually going to go deeper than the searches that we've done in the past. And so if you know there's things that we're going to find, we'd love for you to set up an appointment with us and you tell us about it rather than us coming to tell you about it. Okay. In response to that, we circled back about 60 days later, said, did anybody take you up on that? It's like, holy cow, yes. We had 14 people come forward to tell us about their criminal behaviors. And on some of them on the background checks, we didn't even find it. Okay, so it's telling your people you're going to do it that helps them and encourages them to come tell you about it, which is also why I like this idea of a disclosure requirement, just as a part of your onboarding. If someone's going to be an employee or a volunteer, you tell them, hey, it's a requirement here at our church that if there is some interaction you have with the criminal justice system, you're agreeing to affirmatively disclose that to us. Regardless of whether it was fair or not, regardless of whether or not, it was dismissed or deferred or whatever else, it's your job affirmatively to disclose to us. Because see, if you have somebody that engaged in some kind of a criminal behavior, and then 6 months you find out about it, whether the nature of the criminal behavior is a reason for termination or not, simply not disclosing it to me was a basis for termination. Okay, so it's creating the culture to where we're going to run the background check, but giving you the affirmative obligation to have to come tell me rather than me waiting to find it during that periodic, time when I'm going to rerun it. Okay. Now, another thing I want you to have in your mind is know your state's law. Okay. You need to know, not necessarily that there's a patchwork and be able to take a quiz and pass it on what are the different apertures state to state to state, but you definitely need to know what is your state's law. Okay. And don't expect your background check vendor, if they're a national background check vendor, to know what your particular state's law is. But it's important that you understand what it is in the creation of your strategy. Now, in addition, I would recommend skillful screening training. Now, as a follow-up to everybody who's registered in this event, we're going to send some information, and one of those is going to be a link to skillful screening training. The skillful screening training is the training that provides some of the guidance as it relates to stair-step offenses, plea down offenses. Remember earlier when I told you about this person's charged, but then allowed to plea down to something, the skillful screening training will walk you through what are some of those red flag and stair-step offenses and some of those best practices, like the pro tip I gave you on asking the person to bring you an arrest record. Okay. So we're going to provide that to you because, again, a background check fits within a screening process that fits within an effective safety system. So I need for you to have a training as it relates to screening so you can get all what you can out of a background check and not make any mistakes or try to avoid some of the common mistakes. So in summary, here's what I would want you to know. I'm going to send you some additional information. If part of the exercise is using this to challenge you to go evaluate your present strategy, great. Let's go do that. I know from experience that even when a church commits to do that, sometimes it's difficult because they can't fight through the language and they can't get somebody on the phone or a chat to help explain that, especially if explaining that means that customer will lose, that they will leave that background check vendor. Okay. If you need help with that, reach out to my staff. We'll try to help you navigate that, at least to tell you what you're experiencing. And if we can serve you and replace that, we'd love to be able to do that, but part of our goal is to help you be a good consumer. So know this is a summary type of evaluation. Background checks are important, but we need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the background check. We need to understand it fits within a system and it's not a standalone effort. We also need to understand enough about sexual abuse as a trauma creating event as to why that's going to create difficulties in arrest records and ultimately getting convictions. We simply just need to factor that into our thinking as we create a strategy related to background checks. And then good luck fighting through some of the language to understand, is your background check vendor giving you the information that's appropriate in your state? You need to know that rather than learning about it in a rude way and then realizing we have to rerun all the background checks in our particular ministry because we were always being limited. You don't know what you don't know if your vendor was limiting that arbitrarily. Okay. So there's a lot more information I'd love to give you, but trying to keep this in a 90-minute bite-sized evaluation. More information can be found at ministrysafe.com/background checks. But I'm also going to send you a follow-up that's going to give you access to this recorded information, in addition to some access to some additional information that I think you'd find useful. So the goal is good information so that you can make good decisions. But even in making those decisions, we'd love to be able to help you, understand that, but also provide that service for you. And I appreciate the folks at Tidely making this a priority because, of course, they're selling out on the health of the church, and certainly we are as well. So thank you for your 90 minutes of time. Have a nice day.